The first thing you notice in the high Montana territory, when the sun bleeds out behind the mountains, isn't the cold, it's the silence. A deep, heavy quiet that presses in on you, broken only by the cry of the wind. For Abigail Thornfield, that silence was the sound of being alone. 6 months. 6 months since she'd watched the men of the valley lower her husband, Samuel, into the frozen ground. 6 months of running a 300-head cattle ranch with nobody but herself to count on. The work was brutal, the loneliness worse. Every night, she'd stand on her porch, the same porch Samuel had built with his own 2 hands, and she'd hold his old Winchester rifle. Not for the wolves, but for the 2-legged predators who circled a widow's land like vultures. And on this night, as the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, she saw them. 2 riders, dark shapes moving slowly against the dying light. Her knuckles went white on the rifle stock. Travelers were rare. Uninvited travelers after dusk were a threat. She watched them, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. A tall man on a tired horse, and a small shape clinging to his back. A child. They stopped at her gate, and the man swung down. He moved like he'd been in the saddle for a week straight. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice raspy with road dust. "Sorry to trouble you. Name's Nathaniel Blackwood. I was told you might be looking for a ranch hand." Abigail didn't move a muscle. She kept the rifle pointed at the ground, but her thumb was on the hammer. In this land, a wrong decision could be your last. "Who told you that?" "Fella at the general store. Said the widow Thornfield was proud, said she wouldn't ask for help, but she might not turn it away if it came knocking on her door." That sounded like old Henry, meddling as usual. But something in the man's eyes held her. A deep, settled weariness she recognized from her own mirror. "And you just happen to need work?" she asked, her voice flat. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair and a face carved by wind and sun. "Truth is, ma'am, we need a place to winter. My daughter and I can handle cattle, I can fix what's broken, and I don't drink. All I ask is a fair wage and a roof over our heads." Just then, the small child slid down from the horse. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, with big, haunted eyes and a face far too thin. She clutched a worn-out cloth doll like it was the last anchor in a storm. "Papa," the girl whispered, her voice barely a breath of air. "I'm cold." And just like that, something in Abigail's frozen heart cracked. She thought of the empty rooms, the deafening quiet, the second plate she sometimes still set at the table out of habit. A habit that felt like twisting a knife. "What's her name?" Abigail asked, her voice softer now. "Evangeline," he said, "but we call her Evie." Abigail looked at them, really looked, at the man's worn-out boots, the clean patches on his dusty clothes, the way his hand rested protectively on his daughter's shoulder. This wasn't a drifter looking for a handout. This was a father trying to survive. This was a man carrying a heavy loss, just like her. Maybe she was a fool. Maybe she was inviting the devil himself to her supper table. But as she looked at that little girl, shivering in the biting wind, she knew she couldn't turn them away. She couldn't. "You can put your horses in the barn," she said, her voice firm again. "There's stew on the stove. It's too much for one person." Relief washed over the man's face, so profound it was almost painful to watch. "We're obliged, ma'am. Truly." As they walked toward the barn, the little girl's hand locked tight in her father's. Abigail felt it. A flicker of something that wasn't grief. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was just life. Stubborn and persistent. And for the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel entirely alone in the suffocating silence. But as she turned to go inside, she noticed something. A glint of metal tucked into the man's saddle roll. It wasn't a rifle or a pistol. It was smaller, and it looked strangely like the silver star of a lawman's badge. Why would a simple ranch hand, a drifter, be carrying a badge? She pushed the thought aside. Winter was coming, and tonight her house would have 3 bowls on the table instead of 1. For now, that was enough. But a seed of unease had been planted, a feeling that this man, Nathaniel Blackwood, was much more than he appeared, and that the trouble he was running from might just be riding right behind him. The cabin felt different with them inside. warmer. The silence had been replaced by the quiet sounds of two strangers trying to be small, trying not to impose. Evangeline's eyes, wide and dark, took in every detail of the small room, from the patchwork quilts on the wall to the crackling fire in the hearth. "It's pretty," she whispered, so softly Abigail almost didn't hear it. Then she looked at her father, a flicker of fear in her eyes as if she'd spoken out of turn. "It's all right, sweet pea," Abigail said, her voice gentle. "I think it's pretty too." Over a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread, the story came out in bits and pieces. Nathaniel's wife, Martha, taken by a fever 4 months prior. A small ranch in Wyoming they'd lost. The long ride looking for work, finding none. Most folks, he explained, didn't want a hand with a child in tow. "Sometimes," he said, staring into his empty bowl, "staying put hurts worse than moving on." Abigail knew that feeling in her bones. She looked at Evangeline, who was already nodding off, her small head propped on her arm. "I have a small room off the kitchen," Abigail heard herself say. "It's not much, but it's warm. $30 a month, plus board. You'll earn every penny of it." Nathaniel's head snapped up. His eyes bored into hers, searching for the catch. "You're offering me the job." "I'm offering you a trial," she corrected. "This ranch doesn't forgive mistakes, and winter is almost here." They shook on it. His hand was rough and calloused, just like hers. It was a frontier contract, sealed by necessity. As Abigail carried the sleeping Evangeline to the small room, the child stirred, her little arms wrapping around Abigail's neck in a gesture of pure, unconscious trust. It was a feeling so foreign, so powerful, it nearly brought Abigail to her knees. Later, as Nathaniel stood by the fire, he looked up at her. "I'm grateful, Mrs. Thornfield." "Abigail," she said, "and save your gratitude. Tomorrow the work begins." She saw the understanding in his eyes, the shared language of grief. "It gets easier," he said quietly. "Not easy, but easier." That night, Abigail lay in her bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of other people breathing in her house, the quiet murmur of Nathaniel soothing his daughter back to sleep after a bad dream. For the first time in 6 months, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb, but that glint of silver she'd seen in his saddle roll. It stayed in her mind. Who was this man, really? The next morning, Nathaniel proved his worth. He moved with a quiet competence that spoke of years of hard work. He mended the broken corral fence, rehung a heavy barn door, and sharpened tools that had been dull since Samuel's passing. He worked with a relentless, driving energy, as if physical labor was the only thing that could keep his demons at bay. But there was more to him than just hard work. Abigail saw it in the way he calmed a spooked mare with a low word and a gentle hand. She saw it in the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, watchful and alert, like a soldier in enemy territory. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a protector. And Evangeline, the child, was a ghost. She followed her father everywhere, a silent, watchful shadow. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was in a whisper. She flinched at loud noises. Her nights were filled with terrors that left her crying out for a woman named Mama Martha. One afternoon, Abigail found the little girl in the barn, talking to her cloth doll. Her whispers were urgent, desperate. "He's coming," Evangeline murmured to the doll. "The bad man is coming. We have to hide." "Evie," Abigail said gently, "who's coming?" The girl spun around, her eyes wide with panic. She clutched the doll to her chest and refused to say another word. But Abigail had heard it. A cold dread washed over her. The child wasn't just grieving, she was terrified. She wasn't mourning a memory. She was hiding from a man. That night a storm rolled in, the wind howling like a banshee. As Abigail bolted the door, she saw Nathaniel standing by the window, staring out into the blackness. He wasn't looking at the storm. He was looking at the road. He was watching, waiting. "Who are you running from, Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice low. He turned from the window, and for a second, the mask of the weary ranch hand slipped. In its place was a man Abigail had never seen before. A man who was hard, dangerous, and utterly without fear. "I told you," he said, his voice level. "We lost our place. That's not what I'm asking. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the roar of the wind. The past is a hungry wolf, Abigail, he said finally. You don't want it sniffing at your door. But Abigail had a feeling it was too late. The wolf was already here, and it had followed Nathaniel Blackwood right to her doorstep. The question was, would it devour him, or would it turn on her and the ranch she'd fought so hard to keep? The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was brewing inside her own home. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of domestic routine and unspoken tension. By day they worked. Nathaniel was a force of nature, repairing and reinforcing the ranch against the coming winter. He moved with an efficiency that was almost unnerving, anticipating problems before they arose. Abigail found herself relying on him, trusting his judgment. And slowly Evangeline began to thaw. Under Abigail's patient care, the child started to emerge from her shell. She helped collect eggs, her small face lighting up with wonder at the warm, smooth shells. She learned to scatter corn for the chickens. She even let out a small, breathless giggle when one of the barn kittens pounced on her shoelaces. Each small step forward felt like a monumental victory. But the nights were different. The nights belonged to the ghosts. Evangeline's nightmares continued, and Nathaniel's watchfulness never ceased. Abigail would wake in the dead of night and see him, a dark silhouette by the window, staring out at the empty, moonlit land. He was a good man. She knew that in her gut. He was gentle with his daughter, respectful to her, and tireless in his work. But he was also a man living in a fortress, with walls so high she couldn't see over them. One evening, while mending one of Evangeline's dresses, Abigail's needle pricked her finger. A drop of blood welled up. She looked at the tiny red bead, and a thought, sharp and unwelcome, pierced her mind. Samuel. The official report said he was trampled in a cattle stampede. An accident. But Samuel was the best horseman, the best cattleman in the whole territory. He knew cattle better than he knew himself. An accident had never felt right. It was a thought she'd pushed down for months, too painful to examine. But now, living with Nathaniel's quiet secrets, her own unanswered questions started to surface. The first snow came, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. It was beautiful, but it was also a cage. The roads to town would soon be impassable. They were isolated, the three of them, alone with the vast, unforgiving wilderness. That afternoon, they saw the riders, three of them, moving slowly through the fresh snow. They weren't lost travelers. They rode with purpose, with menace. Nathaniel saw them at the same time she did. His entire body went rigid. Abigail, he said, his voice dangerously low. Take Evie, go to the root cellar. Bolt the door from the inside and do not come out, no matter what you hear. Nathaniel, who are they? Do it, now. There was no arguing with that tone. She grabbed a terrified Evangeline and hurried her out the back door towards the cellar. It's a game, sweet pea, she lied, her voice shaking. We're playing hide and seek. As she shut the heavy cellar door, plunging them into the cold, earthy darkness, she heard the riders pull up in the yard. Blackwood, a voice snarled. It was a sound full of gravel and hate. We know you're in there, and we know you've got the girl. Cyrus Hartwell sends his regards. Cyrus Hartwell. The name hit Abigail like a physical blow. Hartwell was the wealthiest, most ruthless rancher in the territory. A man who bought up smaller ranches by any means necessary. A man who had made Samuel a generous offer for their land just a month before he died. An offer Samuel had refused. Suddenly the pieces started to click into place, forming a picture so horrifying she could barely breathe. Samuel's accident, Nathaniel's secrets, Evangeline's terror. It was all connected, and Cyrus Hartwell was the spider at the center of the web. From outside, she heard Nathaniel's voice, calm and steady. You've got the wrong man. I'm just a hired hand. A cruel laugh echoed through the wood of the cellar door. You were never just anything, Marshall, and you took something that belongs to Mr. Hartwell. We're here to take it back, along with the girl. She's the last loose end. Marshall, so it was true. The badge was real. But what had he taken? What loose end was Evangeline? Down in the cold, damp dark, clinging to a trembling child, Abigail understood. They hadn't found a hired hand. They had taken in a witness. And the most dangerous man in Montana wanted them dead. The flimsy cellar door suddenly felt like no protection at all. The cold of the root cellar seeped into Abigail's bones, but it was nothing compared to the ice in her veins. Above them, she could hear the crunch of boots in the snow, the low, menacing murmur of voices. They were surrounding the house. In the darkness, Evangeline whimpered, burying her face in Abigail's dress. "It's the bad man, isn't it?" she whispered. "The man from the wagon." "Shh, sweet pea," Abigail soothed, her mind racing. "The wagon? What wagon?" "You're a hard man to find, Blackwood," the voice from outside, Pike Morrison, snarled. Abigail knew the name. Morrison was Hartwell's chief enforcer, a man with a reputation for cruelty. But a man with a child leaves a trail. Now you can send the girl out, and we can make this quick for you, or we can burn this whole place to the ground with all of you inside. There was a long, tense silence. Abigail held her breath. What was Nathaniel doing? What could one man do against three? Then Nathaniel's voice cut through the air, and it was not the voice of the quiet, grieving rancher she knew. It was cold, hard, and utterly confident. "You seem to have me outnumbered, Pike, but you've made one mistake. You came to my home." Suddenly the world exploded. A gunshot, deafeningly loud from the front of the house, then another from the back. It was impossible. He couldn't be in two places at once. Another shot rang out, and one of the men outside screamed, a sharp, ugly sound that was cut off abruptly. How was he doing it? Abigail pressed her ear to the cellar door, trying to make sense of the chaos. The remaining two men were shouting, confused. "Where is he? I can't see him." And then she heard it, a faint scraping sound from the far corner of the cellar. A section of the stone wall was moving. A dark opening appeared, leading out into the crawl space under the porch. A secret exit. Samuel had never told her about it, but Nathaniel had found it. He hadn't been trapped in the house at all. He had been flanking them. A brilliant, terrifying strategist was defending her home. This was the real Nathaniel Blackwood, the U.S. Marshal. The gunshots stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Abigail waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Had he won? Was he hurt? Was he dead? Finally, she heard footsteps on the porch above, then the sound of the main cabin door opening. "Abigail!" His voice was low, strained. Her hands shaking, she fumbled with the bolt and pushed the heavy cellar door open. The light was blinding. Nathaniel stood there, his face grim, his pistol still in his hand. There was a long, bloody gash on his forearm, but he was alive. He was standing. Behind him, through the open doorway, she could see two bodies lying motionless in the snow. A third man was nowhere in sight. "Did you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "One ran," he said, his voice flat. "The other two won't be bothering anyone again." He looked down at the terrified child still clinging to Abigail. His hard expression softened. "It's over, Evie. You're safe." He walked them back into the warmth of the cabin, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. He slumped into a chair, the adrenaline finally leaving him. He looked exhausted, older. "You have questions," he said. It wasn't a question. "Evangeline," Abigail said, her voice trembling slightly. "She said something about a wagon. She asked if it was the man from the wagon." Nathaniel closed his eyes. The story that came out was a torrent, a confession held back for too long. He had been a U.S. Marshal on the verge of exposing Hartwell's entire criminal operation. Land fraud, murder for hire, everything. Evangeline wasn't his daughter. Her parents, homesteaders named Miller, were his key witnesses. They had the account books, the proof that would put Hartwell away for life. But Hartwell's men found them first. "I got there too late," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with guilt. "The homestead was on fire. The Millers were gone. I found Evie hiding in a feed wagon, terrified, covered in soot. She was the only survivor, the only other person who could identify the killers. His own wife, Martha, hadn't died of a fever. It was a lie to protect Evangeline. Martha had been killed in a botched robbery back in Wyoming, a message from Hartwell, a warning to drop the case. So he had. He'd vanished. He'd taken the last name Blackwood from a gravestone and taken the witness, the little girl he'd sworn to protect, on the run. The account books, the evidence he'd sworn to get, were the real reason they were traveling so light. They were sewn into the lining of Evangeline's cloth doll. Abigail stared at the doll, now lying on the floor, a child's toy, a ticking time bomb. "So you brought this war to my doorstep," she whispered, the full weight of it crashing down on her. "I never meant to," he said, his voice raw. "I just needed a place to disappear, a place to keep her safe. I saw this ranch, isolated, run by a widow. I thought we could be invisible here." But they hadn't been invisible. The man who got away would ride back to Hartwell, and Hartwell would not stop. He would send more men, an army if he had to. He would burn the entire valley to the ground to get that doll and silence the little girl who held it. Abigail looked from the hardened lawman in her kitchen to the orphaned child who thought he was her father. She looked at the blood on his arm and the bodies in her yard. Her quiet life was over. The fragile peace she had been building was shattered. She had a choice. She could tell him to take the child and the doll and run, or she could stand and fight. Fight for the man who had just saved her life. Fight for the little girl who had stolen her heart. Fight for the memory of her husband, who she now suspected had also been a victim of Hartwell's greed. "He killed Samuel, didn't he?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "My husband found out something, and Hartwell had him killed." Nathaniel met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the terrible, unspoken truth. "I think so." Abigail walked to the fireplace and picked up the Winchester. She worked the lever, chambering around. The sound was crisp, final, in the quiet room. "Then they didn't come to your home," she said, her voice filled with a cold, hard fury he had never heard before. "They came to ours." The truce was over. The war had begun, and Abigail Thornfield was no longer just a widow. She was a soldier. The first thing they did was dispose of the bodies. It was grim, grisly work, but necessary. They couldn't leave them for the wolves or for Hartwell's men to find. Under the cover of the swirling snow, they dragged them deep into the woods. Nathaniel was methodical, his movements efficient, as if he'd done this a dozen times before. Abigail just focused on the work, pushing down the horror, channeling it into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. When they returned to the cabin, the sun was a pale, watery smudge in the sky. The blood in the snow was already being covered by a fresh, white blanket, as if the world itself was trying to erase the violence of the night before. But it couldn't be erased. It was burned into Abigail's memory. "The man who got away," she said, watching Nathaniel clean and stitch the gash on his arm. "He'll be back to Hartwell by morning." "I know," Nathaniel replied, his jaw tight. "Hartwell won't send 3 men next time. He'll send 30. He'll level this place." "So we run?" Nathaniel stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "There is no running from a man like Hartwell. Not anymore. He knows I'm here. He knows the evidence is here." He gestured toward Evangeline, who was asleep on the hearth rug, her small face peaceful for the first time in days. "And he knows the only living witness is here. The only place we'll be safe is on the other side of his grave." A shiver went down Abigail's spine, but she didn't argue. He was right. This fight could only end one way. "We need help," she said. "I can't fight an army, and neither can you." "Your neighbors? The other ranchers?" "They don't like Hartwell," Abigail admitted, "but they fear him more. They have families to protect. They won't risk starting a war." "Then we have to give them a reason to fight," Nathaniel said. "We have to show them that not fighting is the bigger risk." His plan was audacious. It was dangerous. It was likely to get them all killed. But it was the only chance they had. He would take the fight to Hartwell. "Hartwell's power comes from 2 things," Nathaniel explained, pacing the small cabin. "His wealth and the fear he inspires. We can't touch his money, but we can break the fear." He stopped and looked at Abigail. "He has a supply line, a weekly wagon that brings in payroll, ammunition, and whiskey for his men from a depot 2 days' ride from here. It's his lifeblood. We're going to cut it." "Just the 2 of us?" Abigail asked, stunned. "Just the 2 of us," he confirmed. "We hit them, we take the payroll, and we disappear. When his men don't get paid, When their whiskey runs dry, they'll get nervous. They'll start to wonder if Hartwell is as powerful as they thought. Fear is a disease, Abigail. We're going to infect his whole operation with it. It was insane. But as she looked at him, at the fierce intelligence burning in his eyes, she believed it could work. What about Evangeline? She stays here. She'll be safer here than on the trail with us. We'll fortify the cabin, leave her with enough food and water for 3 days. No one will think to look for her here if we're gone. The thought of leaving the child alone was terrifying, but the thought of taking her with them was worse. For the next 24 hours, they worked without stopping. They boarded up windows, leaving only small slits to shoot through. They brought water in from the well. They laid out rifles and ammunition at every vantage point. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress. The hardest part was telling Evangeline. They explained that they had to go on a trip, that she had to be a very brave girl and stay hidden. "You're going to fight the bad man," she said, her voice small but not afraid. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "We are." She looked at Abigail. "Will you bring Papa back safe?" "I will," Abigail promised, her heart aching. Before they left, under the cover of a moonless night, Evangeline held out her cloth doll. With a small knife, Abigail carefully slit the seam in its back. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a small, leather-bound ledger. Samuel's ledger. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She had assumed the evidence was the account books from Evangeline's parents. But this was Samuel's. "Your husband was smarter than Hartwell gave him credit for," Nathaniel said grimly. "He was keeping his own records of Hartwell's crimes. Dates, names, payoffs. He must have hidden it with the Millers for safekeeping before Hartwell got to him. This is what they were after all along. This is what he died for." Holding the book in her hands, Abigail felt a surge of white-hot rage. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. This was for Samuel. They hid the ledger deep in the root cellar and sewed the doll back up. Then they rode out. Two shadows against the snow, heading straight into the heart of the enemy's territory. They left behind a small girl in a fortified cabin, a silent prayer on their lips. As they crested the first ridge, Abigail looked back at the single point of light that was her home. She had no idea if she would ever see it again. The ride was brutal. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that gnawed at them through their thick wool coats. They moved fast, speaking little, conserving their energy. Nathaniel navigated the winter landscape with an uncanny instinct, finding paths and passes that Abigail, who had lived here for years, never knew existed. He was a ghost, a phantom, and she was his shadow. They found the supply wagon on the second day, lumbering through a narrow tree-lined canyon. It was perfect, a natural choke point. There were 4 outriders plus 2 men on the wagon box. 6 of them. 2 of them. The odds were not good. "We don't have to kill them," Nathaniel whispered as they watched from the ridge above. "We just have to be smarter than them." He laid out the plan. It was simple, precise, and relied on perfect timing. Abigail's job was to create a diversion, a rock slide. Using her rifle, she was to fire at the rocks above the canyon mouth. Just as the wagon entered, the confusion would be their cover. She crawled into position, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the frozen ground. She sighted down the barrel of the Winchester. She saw the faces of the men below, laughing, sharing a flask. They had no idea that death was watching them from the rocks above. The wagon rolled into the canyon. "Now!" Nathaniel breathed beside her. Abigail fired. The crack of the rifle echoed like a thunderclap. She fired again and again, aiming for the loose scree above the trail. Rocks and snow cascaded down, blocking the path in front of the wagon. The horses screamed and reared. The outriders yelled in confusion, drawing their weapons, firing blindly into the trees. It was the chaos they needed. Nathaniel was gone, a blur of movement down the slope. While the guards were distracted by the rock slide, he came at them from the rear. The first 2 outriders went down without a sound, victims of his silent, deadly efficiency. The third turned just in time to see Nathaniel coming, but a single shot from Abigail's rifle on the ridge ended the fight before it began. The last outrider, seeing his companions fall, panicked. He spurred his horse, trying to flee back the way he came. But Nathaniel was already there, a specter stepping out from behind a tree. One shot, and the man tumbled from his saddle. The two drivers on the wagon box threw down their weapons, their hands shooting into the air. It was over in less than a minute. 4 dead, 2 prisoners. It was swift, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. They tied up the drivers, leaving them by the side of the trail where they would eventually be found. They couldn't risk leaving witnesses who could identify them. It was a cold, hard calculation, and it made Abigail feel sick to her stomach. This was war. They found the strong box under the driver's seat. It was heavy with gold coin, a month's payroll for Hartwell's entire army of thugs. They loaded it onto one of the outriders' horses. Then they did something the guards would never expect. They didn't burn the wagon. They sent it on its way, slapping the lead horse on the rump. The wagon, laden with ammunition and supplies but no payroll, would arrive at Hartwell's ranch. It would be a message. We can get to you any time. We can take whatever we want. As they rode away, the payroll secured, Abigail looked at Nathaniel. The man who had been her quiet, gentle hired hand was gone. In his place was a stone-cold killer, a master tactician. She was both in awe of him and terrified of him. "We did it," she whispered, the reality of it finally sinking in. "This was the easy part," he said, his eyes already scanning the back trail. "Getting home will be harder. When Hartwell finds out, he'll send everyone he has after us. This isn't just about the money anymore. We've wounded his pride. Now he'll want blood." The hope that had flickered in her chest was extinguished by the cold reality of his words. They hadn't won the war. They had just fired the first shot, and the retaliation would be swift and merciless. They were 2 people, alone in the wilderness, with the most powerful man in Montana hunting them like dogs. And Evangeline was waiting for them, a tiny, helpless beacon in the heart of the coming storm. The journey back was a nightmare, a paranoid, exhausting race against time. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Nathaniel pushed them relentlessly, stopping only for the briefest of rests. He was running on pure will, his eyes constantly moving, checking their back trail, studying the terrain ahead. They arrived back at the ranch just before dawn on the 3rd day, slipping through the woods like ghosts. The cabin was dark, silent. For one heart-stopping moment, Abigail was sure they were too late, that Hartwell's men had already been there. Then a light flickered in the window. Evangeline, she was safe. The relief was so overwhelming it made Abigail's knees weak. They burst into the cabin, and the little girl flew into Nathaniel's arms, sobbing with relief. "You came back! You came back!" "We'll always come back for you, sunshine," he murmured, holding her tight. While Abigail checked on the child, Nathaniel did a sweep of the property. He came back inside, his face grim. "They've been here," he said quietly. "Tracks, at least half a dozen riders. They scouted the place, but they didn't approach. They must have seen the boarded-up windows and assumed it was a trap. They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Abigail asked. "For us to show ourselves, or for Hartwell to give the order to attack." The payroll they'd stolen was now their war chest, but it was also a death sentence. Hartwell would not let such an insult stand. The news of the robbery spread through the valley like wildfire. No one knew who was responsible, but a current of excitement, of rebellion, ran through the small homesteads. For the first time, someone had stood up to Cyrus Hartwell and drawn blood. His aura of invincibility was cracked. It was the opening Nathaniel had been waiting for. "It's time," he said to Abigail that night. "It's time to see if your neighbors are cowards or just cautious." Leaving Evangeline asleep, they rode to the nearest ranch, belonging to a man named Tom Patterson. Patterson was a solid, respected man who had been a friend to Samuel. They found him in his barn, sharpening a blade, his face etched with worry. "Heard about the wagon," Patterson said without looking up. "Damn fool thing to do. Hartwell's on the warpath. He's been to every ranch, asking questions, making threats, offering a reward for whoever did it." "It was us," Nathaniel said simply. Patterson dropped the blade. He stared at them, his eyes wide with disbelief, then a flicker of something else. Admiration. "We have the payroll," Nathaniel continued, "enough to hire a dozen gunslingers. But I'd rather have 10 good men who are fighting for their homes than 100 who are just fighting for coin. He looked Patterson square in the eye. "We also have the evidence to put Hartwell away for good. Samuel's ledger. He was murdered, Tom. Just like the Millers. Just like anyone who gets in Hartwell's way. Today he comes for us. Tomorrow he'll come for you." Abigail stepped forward. "Tom, Samuel always said the small ranchers needed to stand together. That it was the only way to survive. Hartwell is trying to choke us all out, one by one. If we don't make a stand here now, there won't be anything left to fight for." Patterson was silent for a long time, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he picked up the blade he had dropped. "My wife's brother was run off his land by Hartwell 2 years ago. Never saw him again." He looked up, and his eyes were full of a cold, slow-burning fire. "You're right. Enough is enough. What's the plan?" One by one, they visited the other ranches that night. The story was the same at each door. Fear warred with anger. But Nathaniel's quiet confidence, Abigail's passionate plea, and the news of Samuel's murder tipped the scales. By dawn, they had their army. It wasn't 30 men, but it was 12. 12 hardened, determined ranchers who knew the land and were finally ready to fight for it. They gathered at the Thornfield Ranch, a small, grim-faced militia. They used Hartwell's own gold to buy ammunition and supplies from a sympathetic store owner in town. They fortified the ranch further, turning it into a veritable fortress. They were no longer just defending a home. They were defending their way of life. The attack came 2 days later, just as the sun was setting. It wasn't a small raiding party. It was an army. At least 40 men, led by Pike Morrison himself, rode out of the trees and formed a line at the edge of the property. They meant to end this once and for all. "Thornfield," Morrison's voice boomed across the snowy fields. "Blackwood, we know you're in there with your stolen money. Send out the girl and the ledger, and Hartwell might let the rest of you live." Inside the cabin, Nathaniel looked at the small group of ranchers assembled around him. "This is it," he said. "Hold your ground. Fire on my signal. Make every shot count." Abigail was stationed at an upstairs window, her Winchester resting on the sill. Her hands were steady. Her heart was calm. The fear was gone, replaced by an icy resolve. She looked out at the army arrayed against them, at the man who had ordered her husband's death. She was not afraid. She was ready. Beside her, Evangeline was not cowering. She was reloading a second rifle, her small hands moving with a practiced efficiency that Abigail had taught her. She was a child of the frontier. She was a survivor. The battle for the valley was about to begin, and the outcome would be decided here, in this small cabin, by a disgraced lawman, a grieving widow, and a handful of farmers who had finally decided they had been pushed too far. The first shot would not be a signal of defeat, but a declaration of independence. The silence before the battle was the loudest thing Abigail had ever heard. It was a taut, humming void, stretched to the breaking point. 40 riders, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset, facing down a fortified ranch house defended by a dozen farmers and a single battle-hardened lawman. Then Pike Morrison raised his arm and brought it down. A guttural roar went up from his men as they spurred their horses forward, a wave of violence and greed surging across the snow. "Now!" Nathaniel's voice, calm and clear, echoed through the house. The world erupted in a symphony of gunfire. The windows of the cabin spit flame, each shot a carefully aimed message of defiance. Riders tumbled from their saddles, their charge faltering as the disciplined, accurate fire from the house took its toll. This wasn't the easy fight they had been promised. They were charging a hornet's nest. Abigail found a strange clarity in the chaos. The world narrowed to the space between her front sight and her target. She wasn't a widow or a victim. She was a protector. She saw a rider leveling his pistol at Tom Patterson's position in the barn. She squeezed the trigger. The man jerked and fell. She worked the lever, found another target, and fired again. There was no hesitation, no remorse. Only the cold, hard certainty of survival. But Hartwell's men were professionals. They regrouped, using the terrain for cover, and began to lay down a withering field of fire. Bullets chewed at the logs of the cabin, splintering wood, shattering what was left of the windows. The battle raged as dusk turned to night. The yard became a no-man's land, littered with the bodies of men and horses. The initial charge had been broken, But now it was a siege. They were trapped, surrounded, and their ammunition would not last forever. Sometime after midnight, there was a lull in the fighting. "They're planning something," Nathaniel said, moving from window to window, checking on his small force. Miraculously, they had only sustained a few minor injuries. They had been lucky. The new attack came from the rear. Under the cover of darkness, a group of Morrison's men had crept up to the barn. A bright orange glow appeared, followed by the terrifying crackle of flames. "They're burning us out!" Patterson yelled from his position. "The barn is gone!" The fire cast an eerie, dancing light over the entire ranch. It was a signal of Hartwell's ruthless determination. He would turn the whole valley to ash to get what he wanted. The sight of the burning barn, the one Samuel had been so proud of, filled Abigail with a fresh wave of fury. "That's it," Nathaniel said, his voice grim. "They've forced our hand. We can't stay here and let them pick us apart. We have to break the siege." His plan was borderline suicidal. He, along with Tom Patterson and two other men, would slip out the back, using the fire as a distraction. They would circle around and attack the main force from behind. It was their only chance to sow enough chaos to break the enemy's lines. "You'll be in charge here," he said to Abigail, pressing a pistol into her hand. "Hold them off as long as you can. Don't let them take the house." He looked at Evangeline, who was huddled by the hearth. "Protect her." "We will," Abigail said, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, an entire conversation passed between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had become to one another. He squeezed her hand, a brief, firm pressure. "Be safe." And then he was gone, a shadow melting into the smoke-filled night. The remaining defenders braced themselves. The fire from the barn had emboldened Morrison's men, and they renewed their assault on the house with a savage intensity. Abigail moved through the cabin, directing the fire, reloading weapons, her voice steady and calm, inspiring the men around her. She was a commander now, leading the defense of her home. They held. For an hour, then two. But they were being bled dry. Their ammunition was critically low. Just when Abigail thought they could hold no longer, she heard it, a fresh volley of gunshots from behind the enemy lines. "Nathaniel." The effect was instantaneous. Morrison's men, caught completely by surprise, their battle lines thrown into chaos, faltered. Shouts of confusion and panic replaced the confident roar of the attack. They were being hit from two sides. Seizing the moment, Abigail yelled, "Now! Push them back!" They poured every last round they had from the windows of the cabin, a final, desperate fusillade. Caught in the crossfire, trapped between the house and Nathaniel's flanking party, Hartwell's army broke. Men threw down their guns and fled into the darkness. But Morrison was not running. Enraged, he spurred his horse directly at the house, his face a mask of pure hate, his pistol aimed at the window where Abigail stood. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the flash from his gun barrel an instant before the bullet struck the log next to her head, sending splinters into her cheek. She raised her own rifle, but he was too close, too fast. Then another shot rang out, not from the house, but from the side. Pike Morrison froze. His eyes went wide with shock. A dark stain blossomed on the front of his shirt. He swayed in the saddle for a moment, then crashed to the ground, dead. Nathaniel stood over him, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. He had saved her. Again. The battle was over. The survivors of Hartwell's army were scattering into the night. The yard was quiet except for the roar of the burning barn and the groans of the wounded. They had done the impossible. They had won. As the sun rose, casting a pink glow on the scene of carnage, the small group of defenders emerged from the cabin. They were exhausted, battered, but victorious. They had stood their ground and held the line. Nathaniel walked to Abigail, his face smudged with soot and gunpowder. He gently touched the bleeding cut on her cheek. "Are you all right?" "I am now," she whispered. But their victory was short-lived. From the road, a new group of riders appeared. Not Hartwell's men. These men wore badges. It was the local sheriff, a man known to be in Hartwell's pocket, and a posse of 20 men. They had come to arrest the lawless farmers who had dared to fight back. "It was a trap," Tom Patterson said, his voice full of despair. "Hartwell knew we'd fight. He just needed an excuse to bring in the law." They were surrounded again, this time by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. They had won the battle, but it seemed they were about to lose the war. There was no escape. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff bellowed, his men leveling their rifles at the exhausted defenders. "You're all under arrest for murder." The taste of victory turned to ash in Abigail's mouth. After everything they had been through, everything they had fought for, it was going to end like this. Disarmed, arrested, hanged. And Hartwell would win after all. But as the sheriff's men advanced, Nathaniel stepped forward. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding up his hand, and in it was the tarnished silver star he had kept hidden for so long. "Sheriff," Nathaniel's voice rang out, clear and authoritative, cutting through the tension. "My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and I'm a U.S. Marshal. You and your men are interfering with a federal investigation. Now, I suggest you stand down." A stunned silence fell over the yard. The sheriff stared, his jaw slack, at the badge glinting in the morning sun. He had come to arrest a drifter. He had found the one man in the territory who outranked him. The one man whose authority came not from a corrupt local landowner, but from the United States government itself. "Marshal?" the sheriff stammered, his bravado evaporating. I had no idea." "I'm sure you didn't," Nathaniel said, his voice dripping with ice. "Now, unless you want to be charged with aiding and abetting a known felon, you will place your employer, Cyrus Hartwell, under arrest. For the murder of Samuel Thornfield, for the murder of the Miller family, and for armed insurrection against a federal officer." The sheriff, pale and sweating, looked from the U.S. Marshal to his own men, then back to the scene of the battle. He saw the grim determination on the faces of the ranchers. He saw the bodies of Hartwell's private army. He realized in that moment that he had backed the wrong horse. With a weak nod, he turned to his posse. "You heard him. Let's go." As the lawmen rode off to arrest the man they had once served, a ragged cheer went up from the small group of defenders. It was over. Truly over. In the aftermath, the full story came out. Samuel's ledger, combined with Evangeline's testimony, was more than enough to convict Hartwell and dismantle his entire criminal empire. The valley was free. Weeks later, as the spring thaw began, the community gathered at the Thornfield Ranch. But they weren't there to fight. They were there to build. Men from every corner of the valley arrived with lumber, tools, and food. In a single weekend, a new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, bigger and stronger than before. It was a monument to their unity, a symbol of their shared victory. On the last day of the barn raising, as the sun set over the mountains, Nathaniel found Abigail standing on the porch, watching the families pack up to go home. The ranch was filled with the sounds of laughter and children playing. He stood beside her, their shoulders brushing. "Look what you started," she said softly. "No," he corrected her. "Look what we started." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Abigail, I've been running for so long, from my past, from my grief. I thought all I had left was a duty to protect a child. I never thought I'd find a home again. I never thought I'd find—" He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," she whispered, turning to face him. "I thought my life ended when I lost Samuel. This house was a prison of memories. You and Evie. You filled it with life again. You gave me something to fight for." From across the yard, Evangeline came running towards them, her face bright with joy, a wildflower tucked behind her ear. She launched herself at them, wrapping her small arms around both their waists, pulling them into a hug. "Can we stay here forever?" she asked, her voice muffled against them. "All of us. Together." Nathaniel looked at Abigail over the top of the child's head, his eyes asking a question that had nothing to do with ranching or fighting. It was a question about the future, about building something new on the foundations of their shared grief and hard-won peace. Abigail's answer was not in words. It was in the way she leaned into his embrace, the way she rested her head on his shoulder, the way her hand came up to rest on his. It was a silent, perfect yes. They were a strange patchwork family, forged in violence and loss. A widowed rancher, a haunted lawman, and an orphan child. They had come together as strangers, united by desperation. But standing there on the porch of the home, they had defended with their own blood, Surrounded by the community they had saved, they were no longer just survivors. They were a family, whole, healed, and finally, truly home. The Montana Territory had tried its best to break them, with its harsh winters, its crushing loneliness, and its brutal men. But they had not broken. They had endured. And in the heart of that wild, unforgiving land, they had found not just survival, but salvation. If you were on the edge of your seat following Nathaniel and Abigail's fight for survival, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think. Could you have made the choice to stand and fight? Stories like this, about courage in the face of impossible odds, are what we're all about. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of the unknown. Thank you for watching.